Daniel Stanton, former executive manager at CSIS, thank you for joining us today.
Oh, my pleasure, Mesa.
Many Canadians were shocked by the news of the plot against Mr. Irvin Cotler. However, the Iranian community wasn't so much because they've been warning about this over and over. And some would say that the authorities in Canada didn't take the warnings quite seriously. What is your take on this?
Well, I was shocked too, as a lot of Canadians were, until after, upon reflection, you realize that these are the targets of a repressive regime. My understanding is, the precautions were pretty good as far as Mr. Cotler's safety. Once the intelligence was received that he was a specific target and it was a credible threat, law enforcement was engaged and he had very high-level physical security on him. And that my impression is the government basically took it very seriously and wasn't going to leave anything to chance.
Do you think for Mr. Cotler, because he was really well known, he's been in politics for quite a long time and he's, basically against the government of Iran, he's been advocating listing the IRGC as a terrorist entity for almost 16 years. Well, because of his position in the government, he was well protected, but in the Iranian community, there are many people who are, being the voice of the Iranian people inside of the country who are being threatened here in Canada. Do you think the government has the capacity to actually protect everybody here?
I don't think they do have the capacity. I mean, he was, as you say, a man of prominence. He had status, he had influence, and so of course he's able to voice his views and things like that. And there are people, in the Iranian Canadian community who don't know where to turn, who maybe don't even know the fact that they can report this to the government, and in many cases just have to tolerate the harassment and the threats. And I think that's the core problem of transnational repression, is it is so comprehensive in its targeting, but only a few can really speak out.
Mm-hmm. On the topic of foreign interference, there was a report in Global News saying that at least 700 people with ties to the Islamic Republic of Iran live in Canada. Many of the agents of the Islamic Republic of Iran have been here. 9 of them were reported to be expelled from Canada. Yes. Only 2 went through and none were expelled so far, or at least we don't know. With the process going so slowly, do you think it actually gives the opportunity to the Islamic Republic for foreign interference, which has been a serious topic for quite a while now?
It does, Mesa. The problem is, if we look at immigration frontline screening, or filtering as sometimes we call it, the government has what we call profiles. So for example, they would look at people coming from a country and see, do they meet the threshold of a terrorist? Do they meet the threshold of a spy? Maybe are there someone that might be procuring, let's say, for a weapons of mass destruction program? So there's certain specific categories that will require the person to get a second interview or some closer scrutiny, or in some cases, a visa denial. But I think some that are coming that may be pro-regime, may have links to the regime, not necessarily the intelligence services, and obviously not linked to a terrorist organization like the IRGC, they can just slip right through the process. So what the government needs to do, particularly CBSA and immigration, is they need to revise and tighten up these profiles so that when they sit down in front of an immigration officer, that officer is looking for more than links to terrorism or espionage, because chances are they're not going to find it.
Right. Now, as for the IRGC being listed as a terrorist entity in Canada, it took quite a while for it to be listed. Yes. Mr. Cotler was advocating it for 16 years. It was on the table of the government of Canada since 2018. It is now listed, yes, and it's a relief for many Iranians. But how effective is it? I think in some ways, and I don't mean to be disrespectful, it is ultimately a political decision. And I think it's also it's a very emotive issue, whether the IRGC should be listed. Now, Canada listed the Quads Force of the IRGC quite some time, because of course they have been tagged with a lot of dirty work and terrorist activity and so on. And so the listing doesn't hurt. It is going to be more effective in terms of some sanctions and things like that, and
financial issues and exchanges of money. But it doesn't give, for example, CSIS or the RCMP any extra edge in targeting them. They still would meet the threshold as terrorists. So CSIS would operate against the IRGC overseas as well as in Canada, and the RCMP would be able to prosecute anyone linked to the IRGC, and they don't need a listing to do that. But because it's been raised, in the context of a lot of terrible activities that have happened outside Iran, and linked to the plane that went down, I think a lot of people think that by having it listed, by making that statement that the IRGC is basically a terrorist entity, that somehow some good will come of it. So I don't think there's any downside to listing it, but I don't think listing it means the community is going to be safer.
Do we have any information about the suspects who were threatening Mr. Cutler?
I don't believe we do. I suspect a lot of that right now is a close hold. The reason is because when there's an ongoing criminal investigation, while they're at the evidentiary collection stage, this is the police, you can't have anything released because then that can be used later by the defense, or you can say they didn't get a fair trial.
This is not the first time that the Iranian government is hiring people inside Canada to carry out assassinations here in Canada and also in the USA. I think, from my perspective, that the Iranian government has too many people in Canada, has a good access to hire people, can spot potential people who can actually work with them. How can this be limited?
Well, see, this is it's almost a new paradigm shift in terms of intelligence activity, hostile intelligence service activity. Generally speaking, intelligence agencies don't use criminals because they're like a lightning rod for law enforcement. They're indiscreet. They're just not reliable. But what's happened with regimes like Iran, India, Russia in particular, I may have missed a few, they're engaging people that are very unsavory. So let's look at the plot in the United States, the one against Masih Alinejad and former President-elect Trump. There's an individual called Shakiri. He's a criminal. He was deported after his prison sentence in the United States back to Iran, and he had made criminal associations in New York. So he leveraged those connections to conduct surveillance and to target Ms. Alinejad. And that's who the IRGC, or sometimes the Ministry of Intelligence and Security, use to carry out the dirty work. And it provides a firewall between the activity in New York or Canada and the Iranian regime. So this is very new for Canadian intelligence, law enforcement, to have this phenomenon where they have to actually start looking at criminals as opposed to just regular people who are working as sources. So it's daunting, but the fact that the attempt on Mr. Cutler was neutralized and he was safe, so far, our system's working. Mm-hmm. Good intelligence, good law enforcement, saved a life.
Right. Many Iranian Canadians are watching this interview, and many are still worried about their well-being here in Canada. You mentioned good intelligence. Do you think that the good intelligence also goes as far as the Iranian community? Are they being protected?
I think so far, yes. My concern is, there's a bit of serendipity with good intelligence. And in this case with Mr. Cutler, I think everyone got lucky because obviously the Canadian government is privy to good, solid, specific intelligence, and they were able to save him. But I mean, unfortunately, history is laden with a lot of intelligence failures. Sometimes it just happens. We have, the Air India tragedy, for example, the Air India bombing tragedy. So my concern is that at some point, if the threat increases, Canada, as well as with their intelligence partners, might miss something. And so I don't know if that's a good answer in terms of the community in Canada. All I would say is I think their fears are legitimate, but I think for the time being, you have to be confident that the government's going to do a good job in protecting them.
In your position, what is your suggestion to the Iranian community who sometimes feel threatened? I
think when you have a threat, reach out, convey it. The challenge for the government is to try to link that threat to the foreign entity, in this case, the Iranian regime. Like there has to be something specific there. And that's the problem. That's the problem with foreign interference as well, is there's usually these layers and levels in between Tehran and the activity in, let's say, Toronto. And for agencies like CSIS, they need to have some idea who's behind it and then sort of work back, follow the breadcrumbs back. And with that, they need specific information.
Mm-hmm. And as my final question, do you think lack of the diplomatic relations between Iran and Canada takes away the will of the Canadian government to actually take the interference of the Islamic Republic here seriously?
Well, I think it certainly makes it hard to deal with Iran on it. I mean, the embassy has been shut down, I think, for about 15 years or so in Ottawa. And of course, the Canadian mission in Tehran was closed down 15, 16 years ago.
2012.
Okay, there we go. And so that makes it challenging to have any dialogue. I don't know if having a dialogue with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Iran is really going to change anything. I don't really see they're a big player in this. It's the IRGC. All roads are going back to the IRGC, all going back to that evil regime. And I don't know if the fact that Global Affairs might be able to talk to some senior Ministry of Foreign Affairs official in Tehran would in any way alleviate that. It wouldn't cut any slack in dealing with India or Russia. I don't think Iran would be an exception.
Okay. Thank you very much for your time.
Oh, my pleasure.